Okay, good morning to everyone. As usual, what we're going to do is, as we get started, I'm going to manage the list of people who sign on, and we're also featured live on Facebook and recording this talk, so it will be available later for our membership and for others. I want to, before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank Alan Kadish, who helped us prepare. Alan Kadish helped us put this morning together. And Touro College. Today's guest is someone who is no stranger to the village of Skokie, former member of our shul and of our community, esteemed Dr. Alan Kadish. Dr. Kadish is the president of Touro College University System, which is the largest Jewish-sponsored educational institution in the United States. Before succeeding Dr. Bernard Lander as Touro's second president in March 2010, Dr. Kadish distinguished himself as a prominent cardiologist and a dedicated teacher and researcher, and an experienced administrator. A graduate of the Albert Einstein College of Medicine University, Dr. Kadish received his postdoctoral training at Brigham and Women's Hospital, an affiliate of Harvard Medical School, and at the Hospital University of Pennsylvania, where he was a fellow in cardiology, a board certified in internal medicine, cardiovascular disease, and cardiac electrophysiology. Previously served as the senior provost and chief operating officer. Dr. Kadish taught at the University of Michigan, held a 19-year tenure at Northwestern University, where he served at Northwestern University as the Chester and Deborah Cooley Professor of Medicine, Senior Associate Chief of the Cardiology Division, Director of the Cardiovascular Clinical Trials Unit, and sat on the Finance and Investment Committees of Northwestern Clinical Practical Plan. He's helped Touro expand its unique offerings for Jewish and underserved communities while becoming a top-tier institution for the study of health sciences and medicine. The distinct medical programs, 2 colleges of pharmacy, 5 colleges of medicine, and College of Dental Medicine graduate schools and programs in health sciences are all what he is responsible for and has helped create and cultivate and grow, as well as 2 colleges of pharmacy, 5 colleges of medicine, dental medicine, graduate school programs, health sciences. They serve increasingly large and dynamic student populations and one of the largest healthcare educational systems in the United States. Dr. Kadish has really been the one who has positioned Touro to lead a new era in medicine. It is a privilege and an honor to welcome friend, congregant, and a role model of mine, Dr. Alan Kadish, and we send warmest regards, of course, to Connie, to the kids, and we miss you here very much in Skokie, in Chicago. We know you're doing great work on behalf of the Jewish people. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Kadish. Let me spotlight his video, make sure that Dr. Kadish has the ability to post as well to the screen.
So first of all, Rabbi Gelman, thank you so much for the very kind introduction. I really enjoyed Chovevei as well as Skokie, and we do miss it greatly. Although, as Jews have it, we've made a life here as well. So I'm going to take the advantage of the fact that we're talking on Sunday morning to try to do a PowerPoint presentation. And please let me know if everyone can see this. It should be filling the whole screen. Are you able to hear me? Okay, and see the screen? Great. So Rabbi Gelman asked me to talk about what colleges and universities would look like after COVID. This slide shows my answer, which is basically that I have absolutely no idea, because as you'll see, many of the predictions that were made about what would happen during COVID to college and universities have been unreliable. And so if you ask me what I really know about what's going to happen, the answer is nothing. But what I'll try to do is tell you a little bit about what I see as the states of colleges and universities before COVID, what's happened during COVID, and what the possibilities are for after COVID. So first, a couple of quick disclosures. Slides are all from public sources. I apologize for the fact that they're not all referenced, but they're all publicly available, except for the slides that relate to the student surveys and faculty surveys at Touro, which I'm going to share with you just to give you a sense of what students and faculty feel about things. And yes, in talking about colleges and universities, I do have a conflict of interest. So I thought I'd start with something that was traditionally Jewish. In one sense, Jewish universities have been around for a while. The Sura Academy was founded in 225 and was a yeshiva for about 800 years. After the first generation of Amoraim, Yehuda ben Yechezkel went to the city of Pumbedisa and established a yeshiva there. There were actually two others, Neharda, which you've seen about here, Mechuzah, and perhaps some smaller ones. But Sura and Pumbedisa were the two most famous ones. And this transition from the era of the Talmud to the era of the Gaonim. And about 1988, Pumbedisa actually moved from Pumbedisa, which was a town in Iraq, to Baghdad, because the Jewish community migrated to Baghdad. The last well-known leader of the Academy of Pumbedisa was Cheskia Gon, who was both a Reish Galusa, the head of the Jewish community, as well as the head of Pumbedisa. But by some accounts, he was then tortured to death by Muslims. And some suggest that the academy closed in 1058. However, there are other sources that suggest that even after the massacre, Pumbedisa in its earlier form was open until 1300. And there are some other sources which claim that essentially the same academy, although by a different name, remained open until 1965. So if you kind of do the math, that suggests that this institution of Jewish higher learning was around for about 1400 years. So with that brief introduction, I'll turn to the topic at hand. I want to start, as I mentioned, by talking about what I see as the state of colleges and universities before COVID. Things were not all great before COVID, and I'll talk about some of the challenges. In fall of 2019, total enrollment was 17.9 million students, which was the lowest in a decade. And why? What were the challenges? Well, traditional colleges and universities faced increasing competition from online-only schools, from what are called credit aggregators, which are basically institutions which took a little bit of credit here, a little bit of credit there, and got students degrees in a short period of time, as well as non-degree programs, coding academies, and other programs that could get students into the workforce without a college degree. So despite the fact that overall data show that students who graduate college do substantially better than those who don't graduate college, at least financially over the course of their life, there were certain areas where students felt that they did not need to have a college or graduate degree to succeed professionally. And that put some pressure on colleges. Higher education has become an extraordinarily highly regulated industry. And that regulation is expensive and challenging. So we can talk about perhaps a couple of examples of that. One is student loans. About 8 years ago, the federal government decided that banks should no longer provide student loans, that it would be cheaper if colleges provided student loans, which means that colleges might distribute hundreds of millions of dollars of government money every year, either in the form of tuition or in the form of student subsidies for living expenses. However, one can imagine that the responsibility for distributing that much money takes a substantial infrastructure. And in addition to that substantial infrastructure, because it's government money and because it's subject to some extent appropriately to audit, that money must be distributed to the penny correctly. So once every semester, I get an email from the federal government saying, you've distributed $230 million of money this semester, and you're off by $4,132. And if you don't correct this in the next 30 days, you might be subject to penalties, including felony accusation. The federal government provided not $1 to schools to meet this increased burden of giving loans and support directly to students. You're all familiar with the controversies about the limits of free speech on campus. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. There have been several high-profile cases of sexual assault on campus and an extraordinary degree of regulation related to sexual assault on campus. Even one sexual assault is terrible. The data, however, show that college-age women who are not in college are more likely to be assaulted than college-age women who are in college. That doesn't mean for a second that I'm minimizing the problem of sexual assault on campus, but I'm simply suggesting that the media attempts to portray this as a massive failure of institutions to deal with the problem of sexual assault or sexual harassment doesn't really reflect reality. And I'll talk in a moment about what colleges and universities are expected to do to try to protect our students, which every one of us feels compelled to do, but the question is how one should best do it. For the past couple of decades, there have been concerns about tuition. College tuition has risen substantially faster than inflation, and colleges have been criticized for increases in tuition. College athletics has taken, in some people's opinion, an unduly huge role on the college campus and distorted the values that a college ought to be transmitting. And finally, I'll talk in a moment about anti-Semitism on campus. So there's not enough time in this talk about the future to talk much about the past. But one of the most controversial pieces of federal regulation during the Trump administration has been the changes in the way colleges and universities handle accusations of sexual harassment and sexual assault. Title IX is the provision that requires institutions that receive federal money, including colleges and universities in this case, to make sure that there's no sexual discrimination and that things are handled carefully. The problem, of course, is that sexual assault on campus is usually acquaintance-based, which means that even when you have the resources of a large city police department or the FBI investigating what happened, it's often difficult to tell. And what the new regulations don't change is the requirement that colleges and universities essentially act as detectives, jurors, judges, and sentencers for anything that happens on campus. And quite frankly, it's a responsibility. The protection piece of the responsibility is appropriate and is our job, and we can at least try to do that. But being able to adjudicate a complex case of sexual assault on campus is difficult for anyone and impossible for most institutions. And the idea that we ought to be required to do that rather than having an independent body funded by the government to do it is just simply fraught with craziness. Title IX also has challenges in who's a man and who's a woman. For the past 50 years, there's been tremendous progress in women's athletics, and the government now requires the investment in women's athletics to equal the investment in men's athletics. The problem is when men transition to women, but still have higher levels of testosterone and physical bodies that were formed by testosterone, they have an unfair competitive advantage related to women. So how to deal with that is a challenge. Anti-Semitism on campus. I'm just going to show you a couple of quick slides. The USC student leader resigns after she's branded a racist for supporting Zionism. UCLA, something similar happened. So why is there anti-Semitism on campus? Jews are accused at participating or being part of white privilege. And Israel is a major issue. And it is possible, in theory, to criticize the actions of the Israeli government and not be an anti-Semite. It's possible, in theory, to even question things about the way Israel exists and not be an anti-Semite. But that's only in theory. In practice, most virulent anti-Israel sentiment, not anti-Likud sentiment, but anti-Israel sentiment, spills over into anti-Semitism. So why is there anti-Israel sentiment? Sorry, before that, you're all familiar with this. Is from the Daily Northwestern just a couple of weeks ago. President Morton Shapiro's house was attacked. He was called a pig, which the protesters said was not related to his Jewishness, but rather to the Northwestern police force. I'll put a bit of editorializing here. I think President Shapiro probably should have reacted to other events earlier on, but now he's taken a hard line on this and said that expressions of anti-Semitism on campus are not appropriate. And he's been criticized severely for it. So why is there so much anti-Israel sentiment on campus? Well, there are no value judgments in the next couple of slides. I'm simply describing what surveys have shown. This is a survey of the faculty at Harvard, but it's not that different at most American universities, except perhaps in the South and parts of the Southwest. This is their political view. Very liberal, 80%, moderate, 19%, conservative, 1.46%. This is in a country that's obviously deeply divided. I won't say any more about the election, but it's a deeply divided country where the faculty at Harvard are 1.46% conservative, very conservative. But what does that have to do with Israel? You're getting into politics. Well, here's what it has to do with Israel. This is a sympathy, Gallup poll, all Americans, sympathy with Israel in the Middle Eastern situation by party and ideology. So if you're a conservative Republican, 81% are more sympathetic to Israel than to the Palestinians. If you're a moderate or liberal Republican, it's 52%. If you're a moderate Democrat, your support for Israel is at 28%. And if you're a liberal Democrat, which describes 80% of the faculty at Harvard, only 3% of liberal Democrats are more sympathetic to Israel than to the Palestinians. Why this is something that requires an entire talk in of itself. And as I said, I'm not editorializing here, I'm not criticizing, but the phenomenology is that there's an extraordinary anti-Israel sentiment on campus. And that extraordinarily anti-Israel sentiment bleeds over into anti-Semitism. So that was before COVID. Universities were a challenging place, an important place, great places, tremendous research. For me personally, great. I've spent my whole career at universities, and I've been by and large extremely happy, with some exceptions. But it was not a uniformly rosy picture before COVID started. So this is projections of what would happen, has been happening, or will happen to universities during COVID. Total losses and expenditures will grow and affect higher education for years. This is not my slide. This is from a public source from a consulting group. Net revenue losses, $1 billion. Expenditures, $600 million. So you're looking at 1.6 billion negative in lost revenue and COVID-related expenses. This is actually a low estimate. Give you a couple of examples. There's an art and engineering school in Brooklyn that's lost $30 million. It's a small school with 2,400 students. Estimates are that if Big Ten football were not played, the University of Michigan might have lost as much as $500 million this year. Employment at colleges has dramatically dropped. Maybe 1/10 of employees have been let go. High school students want to wait to go to college. According to this survey, they want a tuition discount. And there's a huge drop in foreign students who pay full tuition at colleges and universities. This is a look at higher education workforce. You can see that it's dramatically increased. And even with this huge drop, it's still way ahead of what it was 20 years ago, despite the fact that the number of students haven't changed. Again, a topic for another discussion, but this precipitous sudden drop in workforce obviously has a dramatic impact on higher education. So what actually happened? It turns out things were not as bad as supposed. If you look at aggregate, undergraduate enrollment dropped 4%. The reason that enrollment had a more dramatic impact is that the biggest drop was in international students who pay full tuition and don't get scholarships. The drop was greatest at community colleges, but was really across the board, except for for-profit proprietary schools. On the graduate level, it was a little bit different. Graduate enrollment actually increased. Again, mostly at the for-profit schools, but it actually increased across the board. Why was there this dichotomy between graduate and undergraduate enrollment? I think it's because a lot of college graduates weren't able to find work with the change in unemployment rate from 3.7% to as high as 15%, although of course it's dropped now. And so they went to graduate school instead. Skip this. Okay. So net impact of COVID on colleges and universities. Obviously, there was a tremendous switch, which I'll describe to you in a moment, in the way education was delivered. But in terms of the challenges that colleges and universities faced, particularly the financial challenges and the challenges regarding tuition, decline in undergraduate enrollment, decrease in international students. Even many of the schools that stayed open had a dramatic decline in dormitory revenue. And even the athletic programs that have remained open have created a dramatic decline in sports-related revenue. And in addition, suits were being filed to get tuition back from colleges and universities because the students felt that the experience of online or hybrid education wasn't the same as in-person education. Those suits are still ongoing. We don't know what the results will be. Turo was named in one suit, but then dropped. So there was a lot going on before COVID, competition and regulation, and the other issues remain. And the challenges to college and universities have been exacerbated by COVID. So mostly because I have a lot of data, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what our college has done during COVID. And I'm going to show you the results of a number of student and faculty surveys, which will tell you a little bit about the impact of COVID on our process. Just for those of you who aren't that familiar, we're an independent institution of higher education under Jewish auspices, but not a faith-based institution. We were established to transmit and perpetuate the Jewish heritage, as well as to serve the Jewish community. Interesting school that was started in 1970 to 71 by its founder. He was 55 years old when he started the school. He was 94 when he hired me as provost. In 1980, a law school was started. In the 1990s, a California campus was started. In 2004, a campus in Nevada. An osteopathic medical school in Harlem in 2007. A online school was reinvigorated in 2011 and 2013. Another campus in New York State in 2013, the dental school in 2016, PhD in Jewish Studies in 2019, and New York Medical College became part of Touro in 2011. There are a number of programs that are planned in the future. I won't bore you with many of those now. What makes the school unique, and I'm talking about this so that you, when I show you the survey results, you'll understand what group you're looking at. So there's tremendous academic, geographic, and racial diversity at Touro. I showed you a little bit about the geographic diversity. We also have branches in Jerusalem, Moscow, and Berlin. We have schools that are essentially open enrollment schools designed to take people from the Jewish community and otherwise who are academically challenged and bring them up to speed. And then we also have highly competitive schools. New York Medical College this year has 14,100 applicants for 214 spaces. And in many of our schools, there's tremendous racial diversity. We also rapidly respond to changing student and community needs. We have about 10 new programs that are currently planned because we see the landscape for the future changing. We're focused on a liberal arts core, but it's a career-oriented education. We don't offer a major in French Renaissance studies, but we do in actuarial science, pre-health science, finance, real estate, etc. We do have a commitment to fostering Jewish values, which is expressed differently in different parts of the institution. And because, as you'll see, we have a large number of graduate programs, I've mentioned some of them already, we have an excellent path to graduate programs. In the United States, this is where we have undergraduate and graduate programs. The one change to this slide, which I didn't have a chance to update, is that starting sometime in the next 6 to 12 months, we'll have graduate programs in Illinois co-located with Skokie Yeshiva at the Hebrew Theological College. So what's the impact of COVID been on Touro, which will give you some sense of being able to interpret the survey results? So if we look at summer enrollment, surprisingly but not shockingly, summer enrollment was dramatically increased from 2019. Nobody could get a job, so they went to school. Graduate enrollment, fall enrollment has essentially been stable, a little up on the graduate level, as I showed you, mirroring national trends, slightly down on the undergraduate level. Overall, not much change. We've been very busy at the Center for Disaster Medicine at New York Medical College, which is a state-funded center. We did our first COVID seminar on January 31st, and we've tried to do the best we can responding in the New York metropolitan area to the challenges that we faced in the spring, particularly with COVID. But just like Illinois, although not yet as bad, it's coming back. I talked a little bit about how the fact that we continue to expand. This is some of the things that are coming soon. We're incorporating a podiatry school, and we've got 5 potential programs in Illinois. A nursing program, a PA program, a master's in data analytics, and a certificate in cybersecurity. So how did Touro respond to COVID? I talked a little bit about the first symposium was on January 31st. We began remote learning overnight. We had a pilot during the week of Purim, and the day after Purim, we went from in-person to online learning overnight. We were completely remote in the spring semester. We brought our health science schools back in person in June. We're on the ground minimally in the fall with clinical laboratories, and clinical settings, and about 10 to 15% of other classes are on the ground. One interesting thing is that when we surveyed our students in the spring, 50% said they wanted to be in person, but when it came time to actually register for classes, that turned into 15%. So what do students think about the new paradigm of being primarily remote, perhaps with some hybrid courses and some in-person courses? Mostly they're satisfied. So this says, were learning objectives met by Zoom? About 80% said they agree or somewhat agree. How did they rate their experiences? About 67% said it was excellent or good. The percent who felt that the distance education really didn't work was only about 7 or 8%, which is kind of astonishing. But that's what the students told us. Did they attend, were they enrolled in hybrid classes? Yes. Did they attend them in person? Not really. But the ones who didn't attend them in person liked them. So just, I apologize, I should have described a little bit more detail. Hybrid classes mean many different things. In our case, what it meant was students could choose to be in person or remote for education. The ones who attended hybrid classes by Zoom actually were a lot less satisfied than the students who attended the Zoom only classes. And the reason is, even though we made some investments in technology, it was hard for our faculty to be able to manage the in-person students and the remote students at the same time. That proved a challenge. What about the future? When the pandemic is over, will you take online classes? The answer is 63% yes, 17% I don't know. Only 20% probably or definitely not. And what's your preference for the spring 21? About half, slightly more than half said remote only. The other half either didn't know or wanted some mixture. So that tells you a little bit about how students have perceived their online experience. Now, I showed you the aggregate data for what students wanted for the spring. But if you look at this slide, you can see that it very much varied, and the abbreviations or internal abbreviations we use for which school, the only reason for showing you this slide is to show you that what students want to do is vastly different depending on what this school they're in. What does the faculty want to do? The faculty mostly wants to be remote, but it also varies a lot depending on what school you're in. In some schools, more of the faculty want to be in person, or at least somewhat in person. What's the challenge? Well, if you compare what the students want and the faculty want, sometimes it's pretty close. Sometimes it's not so close. So how do you manage a college and university when the students and the faculty want different things? During the question and answer period, perhaps you guys can help me, because I haven't quite figured it out yet. So I want to leave a few minutes for questions. So I'm going to now speculate on what a university post-COVID will look like. One, distance education will continue to play a greater role. If you looked at the results of our student survey and student surveys around the country, the trend that began at Touro about 2-3 years ago, which that even students who were on the ground sometimes took one or more courses online because it made it easier for them to manage their schedule, that trend will continue. How many students will want to do that? How many students will want to be remote only and go to remote only programs? Hard to tell, but I think there will be a fundamental change because students have gotten comfortable with the fact that at least the academic experience that they get in college can be recreated to some extent with in-person education. Second major point I would say is that not all colleges will fare the same. Pre-COVID, as I mentioned, there were pressures on colleges. Some surveys suggested that 1,000 colleges would close in the United States. The biggest pressure is on undergraduate liberal arts schools. Undergraduate liberal arts schools used to be extraordinarily successful. I've learned a lot about undergraduate liberal arts schools in the last few years because I've made 4 trips to undergraduate liberal arts schools that have asked us to bail them out. In no case have we actually done it, but we've taken it seriously. But the pressures they face are that students might pay substantial tuition to go to full service universities, which have their own potential advantages. But except for the very elite liberal arts colleges, students aren't willing to pay $50,000 or $60,000 a year just for tuition to attend a school where, at the end of the day, they won't have a clear path to professional degree when they're done. And that dovetails into what I've talked about a couple of times, which is increased pressure on tuition. So I've talked a little bit about the impact being diverse. One of the diversities will be public versus private schools. Private schools educate, in New York State at least, about 40% of the students. The majority are in public schools. In other states, it's a little bit different. But there's a major component of education both for public and private schools. How public schools do depends on government funding, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. How private schools do depends on how they can compete. And where I see the impact being widely diverse is that there are two schools that will succeed in the post-COVID environment, two types of schools that will succeed in the post-COVID environment. Top-tier schools and schools with special niches. So the top-tier schools are easy to understand. Schools with special niches occupy a whole different series of cases. In some cases, the special niche is that they're academically excellent, even if they're not Ivy League or Ivy League type schools. In other cases, it's because they're well known for athletics or for social interaction, which will lead to success in future careers. In some cases, they're arts or engineering schools that provide a particular skill set that students want. In some cases, they may be religious schools that have a captive audience because they offer a niche that other schools don't have. Those schools, I think, will succeed. I think others will struggle to a significant extent. And none of this, by the way, reflects any comments about the quality of the education in these schools. This is simply an observation about what I think might happen. One example of a school that might succeed is Louisiana State University. This is the swimming pool at Louisiana State University, which costs $100 million. The senators from Louisiana swear that not one penny of public money was used to create this facility. However, of course, the donors who created the facility, might have given money to the engineering department if they hadn't paid for a lazy river. But boy, it looks nice. So LSU might have a leg up. You can't get this from remote education. You also can't get a football team, which of course really isn't a college football team. I agree completely with today's New York Times. We should start paying college athletes and stop making believe they're part of some greater enterprise. They're disproportionately associated with sexual assaults on campus. They're disproportionately associated with academic scandals. I love watching college football, but it shouldn't be part of a college or university. Why is it? Because it's worth billions of dollars. This is one prediction from a consulting firm about what will happen post-COVID. I personally don't know whether the changes will happen to this extent, but it shows a transition from in-person learning to online learning to a hybrid model of a variety of different cases. A pure hybrid program, a flex program, all hybrid classes, technology supported, or virtual reality and artificial intelligence. This is an area where I think there's a dramatic improvement in distance education that may happen. And let me explain to you what I see happening. Right now, distance education consists of a myriad of different things. There are some places which simply record lectures in a classroom, throw them on the internet and say, this is our distance education. Turns out that doesn't work so well. The next level is to record lectures in a different kind of setting, a green room, where you know that the students will watch those lectures online, so you lecture differently. A third level up is to include team-based projects and personal interaction along with pre-recorded lectures. That's what Touro's online-only school does, and that's what Touro College has begun doing for a while. But the next level is artificial intelligence virtual reality. And what that involves is saying, you teach a topic to a student. Let's sort of take it relatively easy, an easy example where acquisition of knowledge can be relatively easily measured. You're teaching introductory calculus. So you teach students derivatives, the fundamental basis of calculus. And after 2 15-minute TED type talks, you ask the student a series of questions and you figure out, do they know what a derivative is? And if the answer is yes, they answer the questions and they know what a derivative is. Then you go on to the next topic. If they don't, you bring in remedial modules to try, and movies to try to bring the student up to speed. That kind of education is education actually that you can't do in a classroom. And if you combine it with virtual reality, which is seeing three-dimensional images via glasses, or actually walking through a slope where you actually slide down a slope as part of a derivative and see what's involved, then you can imagine how that could potentially improve education. How quickly will that happen? How important will it be? How will that be valued by students relative to the idea of being on campus, having social interaction, making contacts which will help you in the future of the job market? That's very hard to say, because there are tremendous things that being on campus does for students. It allows you to be exposed to mentors. It allows you to meet other students. It allows you to make contacts for the future of the job market. It allows you to participate in sports. The campus experience is not going away post-COVID, but I think the number of students who choose a full campus experience will decrease. How much of that will happen? The answer is, I don't really know. And I honestly believe that nobody really knows. A lot will depend on how students have perceived their experience socially, emotionally, and academically when they've not been able to come to class. So, Nevuah went out a while ago, but I'm going to make some guesses now. There'll be lower college enrollment. Non-niche schools will close. I've talked to you a little bit about that. Top tier and niche schools will thrive. Tuition increases will moderate. The online component is here to stay. AI learning will increase. How successful public versus private colleges are depends actually on the January 4th Georgia runoffs. If we have a divided government, resource cuts at public colleges will not be made up. The public colleges in New York State have cut funding by 20%. It's a mind-boggling amount. Now, they spent too much money to start with, but a sudden 20% cut is pretty draconian. And if that continues, public colleges will be under pressure. If there's not a divided government, there will be a dramatic increase in funding for public colleges. Initially, it will be in the form of a huge stimulus package, and subsequently be in the form of increased federal funding for public colleges, perhaps free tuition for community college, subsidized tuition at four-year colleges, and that will change the dynamic of public versus private colleges. I think Touro is going to be fine regardless because of our niche and because of the high percentage of graduate and professional students we have. I hope I'm not being too overly optimistic. And finally, I wish I thought something different about the last bullet point. But despite tremendous efforts to combat anti-Semitism on campus, despite some brilliant people doing tremendously good work, despite some college presidents finally stepping up and fighting anti-Semitism. As long as colleges and universities remain primarily staffed by very liberal faculty, and as long as 3% of liberal and very liberal people support Israel, anti-Semitism is going to remain on college campus. So with that, it's been a struggle for colleges over the past few months, even those that have done okay. We look forward to the Pfizer vaccine, Moderna vaccine, or some others getting us something back to normal, but the future is still pretty unknown. So thanks for your attention. I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Dr. Kadish. I don't know if we have our chat function working for just for safety reasons, but certainly you can unmute yourself and ask a question. I'll just start by saying thank you for that incredibly well-informed and well-prepared presentation. I know that I learned a lot, and I received numerous text messages and various messages throughout the whole lecture about so many people who appreciated what you had to share. It's both frightening and also encouraging to see what you have been able to accomplish. The helm of Touro College. We wish you a yasher koach on that. So if there are any questions, I'll we'll take like 5 minutes worth of questions now if anyone has for Dr. Kadish. Don't be dismayed. My experience has been people are very shy to ask questions via this forum.
Okay.
I have one.
Okay.
I'm actually taking chemistry 105 now at Upton Community College. Mm-hmm. But we have a virtual classes. The professor is teaching in person, and also she records the videos that the students who miss it, so they can watch it or we can watch it again. But I agree, like you say, before the COVID-19, I was searching about the higher education, that this was coming now for the virtual classes didn't come for the COVID. It was already before, they were kind of preparing the students. But I can tell all the future of the higher education, it's telling them that keep going. And like now knowing we have another sources like in the Jewish private schools, so we have to try to look for to continue the education. And I heard something about the higher education that you have that it's in Israel. So how does it work that?
Okay, so thanks for your comments. Israel is complicated, and I could speak about regulation of higher education in Israel for a long time. Foreign universities are not allowed to teach Israelis in Israel. The genesis of that goes back about 13 years ago, where this was some fraud associated with an Eastern European school that had opened a branch in Israel. Personally, I don't think that was a reason to create such a draconian policy, but it's a policy that, of course, the Israeli universities wanted to kind of do anyway, because it made things easier for them. So our branch in Israel educates only Americans. We have about 150 students there, and we're not allowed to educate Israeli citizens. And so it's mostly for our own students who spend a year or two in Israel, whose spouses spend a year or two in Israel, or who want the experience of a year abroad.
And the classes is 100% in English, or?
Classes are 100% in English. We have laboratories, and it's a pretty broad, obviously it's not a full program with only 150 students, but it's a pretty broad array of classes. And it's worked well for us. Prior to this regulation forbidding foreign institutions from educating Israelis, we had a component of that school with several hundred, subsequently 1,200 Israeli students. But we had to split that off, and that was no longer part of Turo and actually didn't succeed. So we're left with a small niche school that educates Americans while they're in Israel.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Dr. Kadish, someone asked me the question. Well, two questions here.
Sure.
Number one is, so we see that there's research as far as what students want and faculty want. Have you gathered data on the party that is paying for the education, the parents generally paying for it, in terms of what they want? Because I've heard anecdotally that many parents of children who are college age or bound for college age, they claim that it's not worth it to pay for an education if they're not on a campus. They're lacking the experience. So is that something that you've gathered data on, and whether does that impact decisions going forward?
It's a great question. And that's part of what I talked about is pressure on tuition. We haven't done it at Turo. We don't have in many of our schools the same sort of full service undergraduate campus that other places do. We have only 1 or 2 sports teams. We don't have theaters. We certainly do have student activities and student clubs, but our undergraduate tuition is actually very, very low for a private school. And so for us at Turo, at least, that issue is not the same thing. We know that around the country, however, parents are saying absolutely what you've just said, which is we're not going to pay $60,000 a year for a distance education, which is why colleges and universities have a strong pressure to try to be on the ground as quickly as they can. And quite frankly, for the fall, I think most college administrators would have told you it's much easier if we had just been fully remote. But there were strong financial pressures and student requests to be on the ground. So I think that colleges will try to be back on the ground. I don't see a fully online program being present at the traditional colleges. I do see more hybrid and technology assisted learning. So you'll still be on campus. And in fact, Harvard this semester has all their classes remote, but they've asked students to be on campus. Or at least they did up to a time when they closed.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question just came in. What was Turo
It's going to
doing?
make our multi-system block. I want to go all flip classroom.
One second, I think someone's unmuted. Who's just talking. So what was Turo doing before COVID on their New York campuses to protect students from anti-Semitism? I guess suppose on the campuses and those who are part of different programs. I guess not the exclusively Jewish ones.
So I have to tell you, we've been incredibly blessed. We have had two incidences of anti-Semitism in the past 11 years at Turo. And one of them actually didn't happen at Turo. One of them was a medical student who, before she entered Turo, posted a number of anti-Semitic things.
That's the one who was kicked out of school.
That's the one who was kicked out of school, someone said in the background. And she actually wasn't kicked out of school. She was identified as an anti-Semite after she graduated because while she was at school, she actually was quiet. And she was then kicked out of residency after school. That was one. And then we had one other small incident. People who come to Turo, even the diverse population, most of our students are not Jewish because we have 12, 13,000 graduate and professional students who reflect the diversity of American society. Even though we give our own students preference for graduate school admission, that's not most of our students. But they know they're coming to a Jewish school. And we've simply not had to deal with the issue, which is extraordinarily lucky, both on the undergraduate and graduate level. There's an occasional comment by a professor, but it's quickly taken care of. And the atmosphere on campus, people have been appreciative of the education they've gotten. And it's been one of the pleasant surprises of being at Turo. Even in places like California and Nevada, where there's a very small percentage of Jewish students, people by and large have been cooperative and friendly and supportive of our mission.
I have a question. Dr. Kadish, I want to ask this as a dentist. I am first want to congratulate you, give you a hearty yoshkoch of establishing the first dental school in New York State in so many years. I'm very proud that you've done this. What about the clinical years? I know the first 2 years, you've already cycled through a couple of classes. So the didactic years I understand online, but what about the clinical years in the dental school? How is that being managed during this period of time?
So we managed to reopen. We have our own internal 110 chair clinical practice where 90% of the clinical education takes place. And we managed to reopen that on June 3rd. And we did it through a program of refitting filters, extensive testing, and extensive use of PPE. And because we were delivering dental services, we were not subject to New York State regulation about schools, but we were viewed as a clinical practice. And so we currently are running at, we still have obviously some distancing going on compared to what we did post-COVID. We're currently running at 83% capacity in the clinic. So 1 out of every 6 days, the students have a different experience to allow us a little bit of distancing. But we're seeing, each student is now seeing 2 to 4 patients a day, which is not so different from what we were doing before.
So you're able to, the students are able to do any aerosol emitting procedures, full operative,
Yeah,
explorative?
they're in moon suits. We do everything, aerosol procedures, oral surgery.
Do you have to fumigate the room between procedures or?
So we've opened longer hours, fumigating the room between procedures.
Very nice.
And we've had, there was a short interruption in the spring, but we were able to get everybody originally graduation was supposed to be in the middle of May. We graduated them in the middle of June. And the current 3rd and 4th year classes are fully in there. And we have an active simulation laboratory. The simulation laboratory is open at 25% capacity through extended hours. So the 1st and 2nd year students still get their time in the sim lab.
And the patients that come there for services have no reluctance. They feel confident that they're right.
We've had no problem.
Okay. Thank you, and Yoshikoch again.
So I should just get off at Skokie Road to drop off at Suits, right?
Thanks.
Oh, yeah, you
Dr.
still
Kadish, I have one more. If you can, everyone can mute themselves and not speaking. I have 2 more questions that just came in.
Sure.
Can you provide a
Just
little bit
thinking
more
I-
information? One second.
I
let me
said 10:30.
mute
Stuff's just
everyone.
gonna sit there, right?
Yeah, sell it.
Can you mute it? We may be able to mute
Not gonna sell
everybody.
it to anyone else, I don't think.
Okay, I took care of it. If someone wants to know if there is more information available on some of the programs that are going to be brought to Chicago in the near future, both through HDC, specifically the PA program, and whether it's known where these programs will all take place.
So good question. So the programs will take place in Skokie. The PA program is probably 2 to 3 years away because the accreditation cycle for PA takes a long time. The didactic part will happen in one of the Skokie Yeshiva buildings. And the clinical part will happen with a couple of hospital chains, which we're currently negotiating with. But I can't yet describe those because those negotiations haven't finished, but I'm confident that they'll be concluded successfully in the near future. The other programs we hope to open in the next 6 to 12 months. There'll be significant components will be online. There may be some in-person sessions also in Skokie.
Thank you. One last question for the day, and we will let you get on with your busy day and everyone else with their Sundays. And we would love to have you back, preferably in person, but we'll take Zoom as well in a few months if we have to. What do you mean by specialty schools? Can you define what a specialty school is versus a top-notch school, a specialty school you mentioned?
So specialty school, for example, is an engineering school or a fashion school or an art school. Those are things that you can't do effectively online. So, and as I mentioned, religious schools at all also. So those schools that have a particular niche, which doesn't exist everywhere, I think will be fine and will actually thrive, as opposed to an undergraduate liberal arts school that may have a few graduate programs in humanities. Those programs we see as suffering, even the ones that are reasonably good.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much for this incredible session. It's very well put together, and I think we all gained a great deal, and with hopefully a little more confidence and less anxiety about the future, knowing that we have leaders such as you at the top. I want to remind everyone that our series continues next week with Karen Hockhauser, November 22nd. If you look on your screen, you'll see afterwards Rabbi Shlomo Katz, Charlie Harari, Didi Deutsch, followed by Dr. David, our very own Dr. David Shivitz, and Rabbi Dr. Zev Elif. We thank Dr. Kadish once again and wish you a great day, a Shavua Tov, and everybody should stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you.